Imtiaz Dharker is a brilliant contemporary poet, famed for her writing around themes of identity, freedom and conflict within society. Imtiaz Dharker tells of the time that she was looking through an old book, and in the final pages on the thin tissue paper, she saw written in her father's beautiful handwriting her own date of birth. She says that in these moments she felt a real connection to her father, a connection that had been lost years previously. And it was this strong connection that had been evoked from a tiny piece of handwriting on a thin piece of paper that gave her the inspiration to write Tissue. She's an exceptionally talented woman. She's a poet, she's an artist, and she's a documentary film writer. She was born in Pakistan, but she grew up in Glasgow. Interestingly, Dharker likes to describe herself as a Scottish Muslim Calvinist. Dharker's poem Tissue is definitely quite ambiguous in places. It evokes that real evasive, impressionistic way of thinking. In fact, a lot of her imagery is down to interpretation of the reader. Her mixed heritage and itinerant lifestyle are at the very heart of her writing. Imaginistic and richly textured poetry that spans geographical and cultural displacement. She aims to question and challenge the received ideas about home, freedom, and faith. You need to be specific when it comes to context. It's great to know about the poet, and it's very important to do so, but have a think about whether it's relevant in terms of your analysis of the poem and whether you can compare this to other poems in your power and conflict cluster. Imtiaz Dharker said that scraps of paper tell the real story of our lives. Keep this in mind when we delve deeper into the poem later on. She also said that the poem follows 3 sets of important images. You've got the tissue itself, or the human skin, set against the rigid structures of society, social, religious, national, but then you have this really significant light imagery that shines through. Ultimately, she has a conflict between power and fragility. So before we read, let's summarise. Imtiaz Dharker uses the extended metaphor of tissue to represent life. She may be suggesting that the significance of human life will outlast the records we make of it on paper or in buildings. There is also a real sense of the fragility of human life and the fact that not everything can last. Let's remind ourselves of the poem. Paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Paper thinned by age or touching, the kind you find in well-used books, the back of the Quran, where a hand has written in the names and histories, who was born to whom, the height and weight, who died where and how, on which sepia date, pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. Maps, too. The sun shines through their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds, fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card, might fly our lives like paper kites. An architect could use all this. Place layer over layer, luminous scripts over numbers over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block, but let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make, find a way to trace a design with living tissue, raise a structure never meant to last, of paper smoothed and stroked and thin to be transparent, turned into your skin. Let's now look at this poem in more detail. Dharker begins her poem by describing the delicate and fragile image of paper, thin and weak enough to let light shine through. Her poem is very much a conversational poem. It mirrors real-life speech, no full rhyme, no regular metre, and it varies from line to line. Like the ideas and the imagery within this poem, the form itself has a kind of freedom and unpredictability to it. Notice the alter in the next part of this line. I guess here we get that first juxtaposition between the fragility of paper, at risk of tearing at any moment, and the power that it can have to change and alter one's life. Here Dharker presents the idea of the ephemeral. Life, like paper, can alter at any minute. Light is an important symbol throughout this poem. It can represent hope, fragility, the weakness of the paper, faith. As we delve deeper into the poem, notice the light imagery and symbolism, and just reflect on what you think it means and how it emphasises her intention and message. Dharker also compares and explores the impact of age on tissue, being the metaphor for human skin here perhaps, given that skin becomes thinner as we grow older, just as paper thins and fades with time. The suggestion here is that age and wisdom go hand in hand, but also that age causes things to degrade or alter as described in the previous line. In the next line, Dharker moves on from that generic description of the thin-aged paper, and she starts to name uses for it. The emphasis here is on the specific kind of paper, the family history written on it, the place in the Quran where generations are recorded and passed on. Here, religion represents the idea of tradition, enlightenment, guidance, faith, belief, identity, and lots more. Think here about the documents written on paper, its longevity, its significance, and its survival. We move on to a central idea of everything being connected, as Dharker describes the personal details that unite us, our names, history, where we were born. Notice how Dharker mentions a hand, not knowing whose hand was responsible for recording all of these details of our lives. We lose the connection with that person perhaps, only to gain it later on when we find the paper, like Dharker, years later. But the fact that there are records leaves us something, whether it's a painting of someone's wife, whether it's a photograph of lives destroyed during the war, it could be half a statue crumbled in the desert. These artefacts aren't just curiosities about the way we used to live, but actually they are things that hold up a mirror to us in the here and the now. It's all of these important facts about you and about your life written on paper that make you who you are. They're pieces of you. They age with you. They're just as significant as you. They're damaged as you're damaged. And it's this significance that Imtiaz is so keen to promote. Again, Dharker tries to show us what the important things in life are, our personal details, histories, things that make us who we are, not those materialistic concepts mentioned later. The metaphor here, the sepia date, is particularly poignant, as sepia is that beigey brown colour that paper turns when it's old and worn out. Dates are incredibly significant. Think about those artefacts that could be old, significant to us as individuals, something that tells more of our own personal story, and could last longer than we may do. There is a beautiful sensuality in these next lines, smoothed, stroked, turned, heightened by the soft sibilance and the quite cutting alliterative T turned transparent attention. Dharker starts to reiterate the metaphor of the tissue being human skin, and you can just picture the soft stroking of one's skin as if to preserve and appreciate its delicacy and beauty. We are reminded that we should give paper and the artefacts it creates the same love and attention and care we do to our own skin, something to protect, to value, and of great significance and worth. Notice the shift again from artefacts now to paper buildings. Here the speaker is revealed. I might feel their drift. We get a further insight into their imagination. It's really interesting to reflect on that metaphor of buildings being made out of paper. It's kind of a reminder that we humans are made of tissue. We may appear strong, but fundamentally we're extremely susceptible. The half-rhyme and transient verbs drift and shift reflect movement and change. This, personified with sigh, suggests that it's a good thing that paper and more broadly us and our lives could be changeable. We can alter and adjust along the winds. We hit another central message of tissue here. Through these lines, we understand how fleeting life is, how brief it is, how easily it's wiped out and can fall away on a sigh. If we understand that life is fragile, we can understand that, despite the fragility, humanity is still strong. Like paper, it endures. Next, we reflect on a different form of paper, maps. This has the power and significance of directing us through life, but ultimately is just lines and marks on a page. Notice the emphasis on these marks, suggesting that the natural rivers are a permanently embedded line in the earth, accompanied by the man-made railway tracks and roads. Metaphorically, the journey we take in life is sometimes political. We have to conform to boundaries and borders, and perhaps maps are a symbol of humanity's need to control and divide. Ultimately, Dharker shows us yet another exceptionally powerful paper artefact that, despite its paper delicateness, is something that structures, organises and guides humanity through life. Here we get the idea that humanity is very much dominated by financial gain. It sets the social structure in place and determines the life that we lead. And then we get that reminder that these man-made materialistic concepts like buildings and financial gain is actually not as important. In this lovely image that these pieces of paper, receipts, maps, could fly about our lives like paper kites, we get that suggestion that Dharker wants us to focus on the things that really matter. Think carefully about who the architect could be here. It could be you, it could be God, it could be a significant person, somebody with a particular skill. I guess by leaving it ambiguous, Dharker highlights the importance of religion, scripture, maths, science, art, culture, things that are more understandable and powerful than these buildings and monoliths that we build. Remember that ideas grow from drawings and scribbles on paper. It starts with an idea and then it is made real by the creator and the architect. It's good to notice the tenses in this poem. We now have a conditional tense, could, might. It reveals the poem's possibility. We get the past, the present and the future in this poem. It's interesting that we've got the idea of daylight breaking through capitals and monoliths here. It's like daylight, this invisible thing, can break through these quite solid and robust structures. Daylight also reflects morning, and I guess here, like Ozymandias and Storm on the Island, the poem works as a metaphor about the battle between humanity and time. But instead of the grim irony that is the destroyed statue or the aggression of the fighting storm, here, Dharker suggests that we should accept the fact that we have no real power over the future and should instead celebrate the grand design of this living tissue. Dharker brings us three important imperatives at the end of her poem. Let the light break through. Find a way to trace the grand design. She's giving us this important advice to take ownership on our own choices in life. Here, the tracing of the grand design suggests that we should reflect on our ability to store and transfer knowledge, storing only that which is purposeful and has meaning. The final imperative, raise a structure. It's our choice to do this. Therefore, we're representing our own human power. The imagery here suggests that we should stop trying to build permanent things, raising a structure never meant to last, and focus more on what's important in life. All those names and details recorded in the back of books, those relationships with people who may physically leave us. If we accept how fragile life is, we might start doing things that are more important and more meaningful. It's almost like in Ozymandias when we reflect on the statues that he creates, but instead of being pessimistic about it, here it's more about embracing what we have. This repetition and reminder of paper that's smoothed and stroked really hits hard her central message. We should treasure the lives around us and focus on them until they're transparent with attention. We need to put so much care and love and attention into things that they're worn thin with use. This phrase is almost cyclical. It references the care and love we should always consider for things that are more important in life. In the final line of the poem, we get the ultimate connection. The paper has turned into our skin. It finally becomes the metaphor for us and our lives. The direct addressed here suggests that instead of being at conflict with the world around us, we should create a sense of ownership and shared identity. Dharker finishes her poem by emphasising our own value and significance. The beauty of life is that it is not eternal, but we get to make the choices of how we live it and what our legacy may be. When it comes to it then, it could be argued that the poem serves as instructions for life and guidance about how to resolve the age-old conflict within us related to our own struggles, to create a meaningful legacy in life and leave something behind us when we die. As a valued part of humanity, we need to reflect on and understand our own limitations and how our powerlessness should be valued and celebrated. As always, we're now going to have a look at the big ideas of the poem. Now, these are only a few to get you started. Have a think and a reflect on more that you could potentially add. Dharker presents power through fragility. Reflect on the imagery and metaphor that creates this. Dharker conveys the ultimate power of time, religion, art, and nature. Dharker looks at the rigidity of structures, religious, social, and national, and how these can cause conflict. Dharker illustrates how mortal power is not eternal or absolute. She shows that the significance of human life will outlast the records we make of it. And finally, Dharker emphasises how we should avoid conflict by valuing things that are more important in life. As always, think about other poems that could fit into these big ideas. Does Shelley, for example, present power through the fragility? Does My Last Duchess have the ultimate power of time and art? Could Remains illustrate how mortal power is not eternal or absolute? Perhaps they do this in similar or quite different ways. It's important to start the discussions around this. Which poem do you think you would use if you were to write a comparative analysis, and why? Definitely be inspired to research more about this poem and the poet herself. I hope you've enjoyed for today.